On today's video, we're going to go over how to fish with bobbers.
This little piggy swallowed my hook.
I don't ever remember catching bluegills this big.
See this? See this hand?
I can't see how many.
Hey there, outdoor YouTubers. It's Dave Knetter from Knetter's Practical Outdoors. And like I said earlier, in today's video, we're going to go over how to fish with bobbers. Now, I know some fishermen call these things floats. All right. And I know a lot of the Europeans refer to these as floats. But I've kind of always called them bobbers. But whether I call them a bobber or a float, I'm going to be referring to the same thing. So when I say bobber, what I'm talking about here is this floating device that attaches to your fishing line that keeps your bait suspended at some point above the bottom. And keeping that bait suspended at some level above the bottom at times can really be beneficial to help you catch more fish. If your bait sinks right down and lays on the bottom, sometimes it can be hidden to the fish, down in the muck, down in the weeds, Suspending it up off the bottom at a certain distance can really get it noticed and also maybe keep you from getting some snags. Also, if the fish are swimming around, say, 10 feet above the bottom, you certainly want to have your bait up there where the fish are swimming. Now, this setup is a real basic bobber setup, okay? You got your bobber, a little bit down from there we got a few sinkers, and a little bit down from there we've got a hook. You cast this out, all right? The bobber stays on the surface. The sinkers go down below the surface. This hook, it's probably got a worm on it or some other kind of bait. That sinks down, and it kind of sits there like this with your bobber right on the surface. A fish comes along, takes your bait. Maybe it pulls the bobber right under the water. Maybe it just makes the bobber bounce up and down. Maybe it makes the bobber travel along the surface. Either way, you know you've got a fish biting on your bait, and you go ahead, hook the fish, and hopefully catch it. And when I refer to bait below the bobber, I'm generally talking about crawlers, worms, leeches, minnows, maybe dead minnows, maybe live minnows. And honestly, a simple bobber setup like this, with just a bobber, a few sinkers, and a hook, has probably caught more fish than any other fishing setup or any other lure in the history of the world. So just a simple bobber setup like this can be very effective for catching fish. Now, this bobber is a clip-on bobber. It has a spring-loaded hook on each end of it, and you kind of press this knob down and one hook is exposed. You put your line underneath it, let the knob go, and it's kind of hooked with one hook. And then oftentimes you'll go around, you'll take your line, you'll push on that knob and expose the other hook, put your line under that one, and let the spring tension grab it. And now you've kind of got this bobber secured on either side of it to the line. Now, as you can see, bobbers come in many different sizes. And what you like to do is match the size of the bobber to the bait that you're using, and also kind of match it to the type of fish you're trying to catch. Okay, now if I was out fishing for muskies with a big live sucker, I might have to use a bigger bobber like this, something that live sucker couldn't actually pull under the water itself. But if I was just out fishing for some bluegills, a bobber like this might be more appropriate. No matter what size bobber you use, if you're going to be fishing for light biting fish, you're going to want to match the buoyancy of your bobber with the weight of your sinkers and your hook and whatever bait is on it. And what I mean by that is if we're out bluegill fishing, okay, and we're using this particular bobber, we want to add enough weight so this bobber kind of sits down a little bit on the surface of the water, okay? We want to make it so when a light biting bluegill comes along, it won't take very much of a tug to pull this bobber under. Okay, you can imagine if we were out bluegill fishing with this bobber and we didn't have hardly any weight attached to it, this bobber's riding like really high on top of the surface. A bluegill comes along, grabs the bait that we got hanging below it, tries to pull it down, and it really runs into a lot of resistance because this is a pretty big bobber and we haven't matched up the weight of our rig to match up with the buoyancy of the bobber. That bluegill's having a tough time. A lot of times, if it's a light biting, finicky fish, it's going to spit that bait out before you can even hook it. Okay, so when you're fishing for a light biting fish, you always want to match up the buoyancy of your bobber with the weight of your rig so it doesn't take a whole lot of pull by that fish to bring that bobber below the surface of the water. Now, these round, hard plastic bobbers like this one are very inexpensive, so they are very popular. But one thing about these bobbers is they're hollow inside, and the air that's inside is what makes them buoyant. But I'll tell you, sometimes after a day of fishing and this bobber has been pulled subsurface several times, you'll start to get little leaks and water will start getting inside this bobber, okay, and it'll change the buoyancy altogether, or you'll get enough water inside this bobber where it won't even float at all. So if I'm going to use a clip-on style of bobber, I like to go with this style, this solid balsa wood type of bobber. And this particular style of bobber just has a spring on one end that you pull back and it exposes this notch. You pull back the spring and you put that line inside of that notch and you let the spring go, and then it's kind of attached to the line. And because these bobbers are solid, they're not susceptible to getting like a small leak and filling up with water and not working for you. And another pretty cool thing about these bobbers, and this kind of brings us back to matching the buoyancy of the bobber up with the weight of your rig, is they've got this, this little narrow point on the top, okay? And if you are really fishing for finicky fish, you can match the weight of your rig up so this bobber just has this little point sticking above the surface. And then when that finicky fish comes along, it does not take hardly any effort at all to pull this bobber subsurface and let you know you're getting a bite. Okay, these two types of bobbers that we went over, these are kind of the two basic types of clip-on bobbers. But before we move on to the third type of bobber that I want to talk about today, let's take a quick time out and get updated on what's happening at Camaro's Crawlers. Camaro's Crawlers is a small bait shop that my buddy Ronnie Camaro runs out of his parents' house where he lives. And Ronnie has always wanted to learn taxidermy. He figured that would be a great addition to his bait shop to be able to offer taxidermy services. Now, a while back, I had mentioned to you guys that Ronnie Camaro had been accepted to an animal stuffing school down in Milwaukee. It all happened kind of fast for Ronnie. He was down in Milwaukee for a Night Seeker concert, and as fate would have it, they were actually passing out flyers for an animal stuffing school right at the concert. So Ronnie filled out an application, and with his bait shop background, he was accepted to the school right on the spot. So last week, Ronnie was down in Milwaukee for his animal stuffing school. And it really seemed like it was going to work out great with his schedule and his budget. The animal stuffing school was only 3 days long, and the tuition was only $500. But I regret to inform you guys that Ronnie will not be adding taxidermy to his bait shop services. It turns out that this animal stuffing school really wasn't taxidermy at all. It was actually a school that taught you how to place stuffed animals into one of those claw machines. I guess there's a whole science to it, the way you configure them inside those claw machines to where you can never actually grab them with the claw and pull them out. I know Ronnie was really disappointed that it wasn't actually a taxidermy school, but the weird thing about it was he went the full 3 days before he realized it. And it's really too bad too, because this animal stuffing school advertised as having 100% job placement upon graduation. I guess the professor that teaches at this animal stuffing school actually owns several of those claw machines himself. So what the deal is, this professor will hire you to stuff his claw machines, once your tuition check clears and you pass the courses. So, I'm sorry to inform you guys, there won't be any taxidermy services at Camaro's Crawlers yet. Now, before we get into that third type of bobber that I want to cover, I do want to explain one thing, right? Now, when you're out fishing with one of these clip-on bobbers, right, you can move it up the line closer to the pole, and that gives you more line below the bobber, so your bait will go further down below the surface. Or if you move it closer to the bait, right, that gives you less line, and your bait is further up in the water column and closer to the surface, right? Now, you can kind of imagine if you wanted to fish with, say, 5 or 6 feet of line below this bobber, that it might be kind of difficult, right, to cast, right? You're bringing back and you've got like 6 feet of line below the bobber. That's a lot of line hanging out to be able to cast, and that's probably going to cause some problems. Well, that's where this third type of bobber that I wanted to talk about comes into play, and that bobber is the slip bobber. And the slip bobber does exactly what it says. It slips up and down the line. This particular one has kind of a tube that runs through the length of it, and the line comes into one end and out the other, and then it can slide up and down that line. Now, you might be saying, okay, well, what's going to happen now? I'm going to cast out, and this particular setup, instead of a hook, I've got a little jig. I would probably still put some kind of bait on this, but you cast it out, this hits the water. We've got some sinkers, right? They start sinking, and the line is just slipping through the bobber, right? Well, we're going to need something to stop it at some point in time, right? Well, what happens is the line slips through, and then there's a couple beads on the line, and the beads come in contact with the top of the bobber, and then what you have is this bobber stop attached to your line, and that's kind of fixed. And now when this bobber stop comes along, it can't pass through those beads, so now your line with the sinkers and the jig have slid down through the bobber till these beads and the bobber stop come in contact, and now that bobber stop can't pass through, so it stops right there. Of course, that's why they call it a bobber stop. Although this bobber stop is kind of meant to stay in one place, if you do want to move it, it can be slid up and down the line, okay? And that's what dictates how much line will go below your bobber when you're out fishing. Now, that is just a quick overview of how a slip bobber works, okay? If you've never used them, I'm sure you've got quite a few more questions on how these things actually work, all right? Now, there's a lot of different types of slip bobbers. There's a lot of different types of bobber stops. Now, a while ago, I did a separate video on slip bobbers and bobber stops. So if you're looking to get some more detailed information on slip bobbers, I will leave a link to that video in the description below. Alright guys, well there's kind of a basic overview on how to fish with bobbers. And if you're new to bobber fishing, I hope that helps you out a little bit. But remember, to hunt fish, laugh, repeat. Hey, you stayed till the end. Just for that, you get some super cool extra bonus bobber content. Now, a lot of fishermen will tell you this is the correct direction to have this style of clip-on bobber attached to your line, okay? With kind of the button and the white facing up and the sinkers and hook below it. Now really, to me, the bobber functions perfectly fine either way, whether you have this button pointed up, and the hook and sinker below, or even if you clip it on this way and have the button pointed down with the hook and sinker below. It doesn't seem to make a whole lot of difference as far as catching fish goes, but I did have a video a while back, and I did show a bobber attached to a fishing pole, and I had it attached like this with the sinker and hook down below with this button pointed down. And a few people left some comments saying that that was really incorrect. But for me personally, I will fish these bobbers. Sometimes I'll fish them with the button and the white side up. Sometimes I'll fish them with the button down and the darker colored up. Okay, and let me explain why. Sometimes you'll be out fishing and there might be a little bit of kind of white froth in different spots on top of the water. So when you cast something like this out and you have the white side pointed up, sometimes it kind of mixes in with the little patches of white froth that are on the surface, and it's not as easy to keep track of where your bobber's at then. So just to let you guys know, some people have some pretty strong opinions on which way these bobbers should sit in the water, okay? But me personally, I haven't noticed any kind of performance difference, and sometimes a certain color is a little easier to see on the surface than another one, so that's the one that I like to have up on that particular day. Okay, so if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment. This is Dave Knetter from Knetter's Practical Outdoors. Hey, thanks for watching and God bless.